Hey everybody, this is Renezuo. I'm doing a little solo thing here because just this past weekend I saw the Netflix remake of Cowboy Bebop, and I purposely went in as blind as I could possibly go on something like this. I had obviously seen a lot of people's initial reactions to the trailer and things like that, but I didn't want to see any reviews or anything like that because I wanted to be able to form my own opinion. Now, some people have asked me what my opinion is on the remake, whether it was good, whether it was bad, and I would say it's mixed, to be honest with you. If you were to place, say, anime, on a scale for anime to live action adaptations, and you were to put it, put Death Note at the very bottom, and you were to put Alita at the very top, for instance, I would say Cowboy Bebop sits somewhere in the middle. If Alita's a 10 and we're saying Death Note's a 1, then we're going to put Cowboy Bebop at about a 5 or a 6. Now, the reasons for that are because some characters and storylines are done very well, like in terms of like some of them I would even say are improvements, whereas others are questionable or sort of a downgrade. So we'll go character by character at first, and then we'll talk about the overall story. And I'm going to try and keep it as to the point as possible because I know people have got other things to do with their lives instead of listening to me talk about weeb stuff. So when it comes to Spike at the very top, I would say Spike is probably the most well portrayed character. In the original, Spike is a blasé character at times or a rascal at others with brief moments of real heart and real seriousness, like real I'm going to kick your ass kind of thing. He's, like I said, a rascal overall, and other times he can be just sort of disengaged. And I think the guy who plays Spike in the remake gets that across at plenty of times. There's sometimes where you get sort of a different vibe from him, but it's very rare. I think he does a real good job in that. The guy who plays Jet, well, Jet is sort of a mixed bag because in the original, I would say Jet is also sort of can be sort of a blasé, casual individual, and in the remake, they kind of make him almost a stereotypical angry black man, which I don't know about that, but they do his overall his personal character arc is more clear in the remake. It is more to the point. It flows better. They don't break up the details a lot in a way that makes you have to like remember what was happening. You get a very clear idea of what his motivation is and what his what happened to him when he was a cop and what the fallout was from that. Why is he a cowboy now? So that's the thing that I feel like the remake does a little bit better. Even though they kind of go with the stereotypical angry black man thing, I think the Jet overall as a character is still pretty decent. Faye is another sort of mixed bag. I would say of the main three characters that you have, the main three main characters, Faye might be the weakest, but they had some pretty big ambitions for her. So, with all of the female characters in this show, you can definitely tell that the people who made this remake are trying to expand their role within the narrative, which is a fair thing to want to do. You have a lot of sort of limited engagement with those characters from the original, but it's not what it didn't necessarily read as kind of this weird chauvinistic or misogynistic crap. But I am never going to say no to people expanding on characters and their lore. So they expand on Faye a little bit, but they change a lot about her background that is sort of pivotal to her character. Now, she's in both versions, she is this amnesiac who was in cryo for too long from time before the gate on Earth exploded. Now, or I guess it didn't explode per se, but whatever. Anyway, so they have that in both versions. Now, in the original, she starts developing this very starkly different personality from when she went in, from before she went in, because of how much of a victim she is coming into this world right out of the gate. She wakes up, she's saddled with a ton of debt. The character of Whitney basically cons her, seduces her, gets her into this whole like romance thing, and then leaves her with his own debt that he wills to her when he fakes his death, which is brutal. But it's not. They don't use that in the remake. It makes sense in the anime why she is the way she is, because her first experience coming into this world is basically just getting screwed over by the powers that be, both on a personal and a larger level. So we have the character of Whitney in the remake, but it's totally different. Whitney is a female. Instead of romancing her, it is a situation where she pretends to be her mother because she doesn't remember who her family is, takes her in, teaches her, how to be kind of a scoundrel as well, takes her identikit, saddles her with debt, and then takes off. She's a serial con artist and has done it to numerous people. And so it doesn't quite seem to me like, it never felt like that would cause the character that we have now. A good thing about Faye, a couple of good things that we have about her in this remake, is that in the original anime, we had moments where Faye would use certain anachronistic turns of phrase or words or ways of talking occasionally, and other characters would kind of pick up on it. Now, the English dub doesn't show it as well, I think, as probably the original Japanese does, but, that's fine. It still comes through from time to time. In the remake, they really focus on that a little bit more, and there are legitimate moments where people are like, wait, what the hell did you just say? Like, sometimes she'll talk like this, by the world standards, old lady who's using just completely outdated vernacular, which is cool. But the other thing that they do with her is that in the original, there was sort of this ambiguity to Faye's actual sexuality. Is she attracted to women? Is she only attracted to men? Is she bisexual? It's ambiguous. In the remake, they flat out have her sleep with a woman who comes on to her, and the character is fine. Mel is a mechanic who is doing some work for Jet to repair the engines of the Bebop, and at the first opportunity, hits on Faye and manages to get her into this little tryst down in the engine room, which is fine. It's done okay, but it's very, it takes the ambiguity out of it entirely, and they specifically say Faye is into ladies. And I don't know if that was a creative choice from the original, that because in the original it like I said, it's ambiguous. Did they intend for it to be ambiguous for the viewer to decide, or was it something that they just couldn't get away with at the time? I don't know. I haven't found anything that says one way or another, but that ambiguity is lost in the remake, and now you have very specifically, this is where she's at, which is, it is fine. It works for the character, and I think it gives a little extra dimension to her in terms of her overall character arc, because right after she kind of has this moment, she starts sort of exploring that a little bit and kind of playing it up as this sort of like stereotypical macho thing. Am I a boobs lady or am I a butt lady? She has that moment, and it would have been great if they didn't immediately pivot away from it. As soon as something else comes up, they turn away from it, and it doesn't come up again really throughout the whole series after that. Now, it does happen, I think, past the halfway point. It's an episode, I think, called Binary Two-Step, which sort of, is another little hint as to what's going on. But they don't really deal with it after that episode. It's basically just kind of gone. So I don't know. It's kind of a cheap ploy if it's not actually part of her character moving forward, if you know what I mean. Like it just feels like a one-off, like, oh, look what we did, we're so progressive. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but it does kind of have like a little bit of that aftertaste to it. So now, as far as secondary characters, I already mentioned Whitney, but there are a lot of secondary characters who are very different like that. And so Anna is one of them. In the original, Anna is this big woman who owns this bodega convenience store type thing, and a lot of the underground, the figures within the underground and the syndicate and everything, can kind of go to her as sort of an information source. But they don't necessarily say that she's like a big player. Like, she's involved, but you're not really sure how deep she is in the whole thing. Well, in the remake, the ambiguity is lost, and they very specifically put her as this owner of a nightclub bar kind of thing, where any criminal element and law enforcement can go, and it's like a neutral ground kind of thing. Kind of got this John Wick vibe, but not quite as high class, and dipped in a little bit of that jazz sauce that is found throughout the whole of the series. So Anna is very different. She's very involved. Even though she's like, oh, I don't get involved, she's very involved with each of the characters on a personal level in some way or another, except for, I think, Jet. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily good or bad, but they do get to use that location as sort of a hub for where a lot of these stories and characters will intersect from time to time, which is both good and bad. But I don't know if it really changes the overall flavor of how the underworld works within this universe, because it has a very different character to it between the anime and the remake, and what kind of underworld you want out of your kind of gray area kind of story, that's really going to come down to you. And well, at any rate, I've been kind of dancing around getting to the character of Vicious, because I have some sort of strong feelings about Vicious, and that's Vicious in the original is, for lack of a better word, his name is what he is. He's vicious for the sake of being vicious. He doesn't have really strong, clear motivations. They're kind of vague, like, oh, I want power. But there's not really a why. There's no really, method to the madness. He is someone who basically cut his way to the top, and you see him kind of finishing that job off throughout the course of the anime. But there's not a lot that is shown of him that gives you a sense of who he is personally, as an individual. The remake obviously cannot take that same route, because it's not a trope that translates over to live action. If they tried to do it that way, the character would have been panned as being one-dimensional. It's something you can get away with in anime, but you cannot get away with in live action. A lot of the heavy lifting in anime can be done with art style, aesthetic, delivery, and it isn't something that you can bank on when it comes to live action. So they got to give Vicious some more to do in the live action. And unfortunately, I don't think they gave him the right things to do. He is still capable with his sword. He is still a vicious individual out to fuck people up. But he's not he doesn't seem like someone who's at the top. He doesn't seem kind of like this Sephiroth type individual, where he's the man with the plan and executes it quickly and decisively at the end of a blade. He is more kind of fumbling. He doesn't necessarily know what he's doing. He feels more like a lackey to the powers that be within the syndicate more than anything. Kind of whiny at times. And he is damaged by the fact that they create this connection with one of the head guys of the syndicate called Caliban. And they basically say, oh, Caliban is his father. It was an abusive relationship. Caliban fucked up his kid really badly, and that's why Vicious is the way he is. And, I mean, it's somewhat compelling, but it really just makes him seem kind of like a bitch in a lot of scenes until he finally gets his moment where he just kills everybody off, which is cool. It's a nice payoff, but you spend a large chunk of the series just kind of watching Vicious be a bitch. Now, the biggest change that we have with the characters in the show comes from Julia. In the original, Julia is a very one-dimensional character. She is sort of just, she's mostly blank. You have some moments where you get an idea of who she is as a person, but it's very much broad strokes, implications kind of thing. They don't really get down into the nitty-gritty of who Julia is. She's very much an blank slate anime waifu character to me, and she doesn't have a lot going for her. She's sexy, she looks good, and she can sing, and that's pretty much Julia right there. That's all you need to know about her from the anime. And in the remake, they take that and they try and build on it. They start her off as kind of like this innocent individual who gets wrapped up in this underworld stuff as she becomes involved with Vicious and Spike, who at the time is not called Spike. They have this little thing that they do with Spike where they call him Fearless. So people within the syndicate, or at least within this family structure of the syndicate, within this small little thing, tend to go by descriptors rather than full names. Vicious is called Vicious for an obvious reason, and then Fearless, being Spike, is called Fearless for, you know, not having shown any fear in his line of duty. He can act decisively regardless of what's in front of him. So that's kind of cool. So, you know, getting back to Julia rolls with these guys for a little while and gets involved. She tries not to be like hands-on with things, but eventually she does get to see what Vicious is all about in his line of work, and she's not really feeling it. She wants to do the whole thing with, you know, the whole running away thing with Spike, but that goes south, obviously, for basically the same reasons as it does in the anime. And Spike disappears and she stays with Vicious, and it turns into this weird kind of like abusive relationship where he is often mistreating her, and everyone is concerned for her safety but won't lift a finger to help her and all this other stuff. And there's this kind of thing going on between her and Anna where Anna is like, you know, I don't want to be involved, but I definitely want to see you safe. But, you know, the only way you can do that is by having power. And eventually Julia, towards the very end, becomes the villain, which is a twist that I did not see. And I apologize for any spoilers, but if you really wanted, you know, to stay away from those, I think it's, you know, this is the wrong place to be. So she becomes the villain. And how that happens is basically she comes to the realization that Spike has been alive for, 3 years, I think they say. He never came back for her. When Vicious told him before, quote, killing him, that she had chosen him, he just took Vicious's word for it at face value, you know, gets taken out and then lays low for 3 years while Julia's in this abusive relationship being, you know, terrorized by her husband that whole time. And she's just kind of like, no, you're not any better than he is. You're just kind of an apathetic, you know, give a shit less nobody who I should not be attached to anymore. And that iconic scene in the church where Vicious and Spike fight and Spike goes out the window and, you know, the grenades get left behind and all that, that doesn't really happen the same way. Instead, it's Julia who shoots him out the window, and Vicious survives that final encounter. But because he has killed his way to the top of the syndicate, he is now one of the elders, or he is the elder. And Julia decides that because no one ever sees the elders, she's going to keep Vicious in chains somewhere, and she will be the voice of the elder. She delivers the edicts and stuff like that. So it's very interesting that she takes that pivot. Now, it's a really big expansion on the character, and I really, like I said with Faye, I think, well, and with Jet even, I think adding these things to these characters is not necessarily bad on its face, but I think that was the wrong direction to go with Julia. If they wanted to give her more agency, which I'm all for, that's fine, but the heel turn, as it were, it feels really sudden because she goes from this whole thing. She has a dramatic scene where she's trying to get back to Spike. She's trying to find him again. And when she finally sees him again, that's when she decides, no, you know what? Fuck this guy. And it doesn't quite track. It doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel like something like, it feels like this was a decision that was made sort of late in development and they couldn't go back and drop those seeds to hint to you that this was a thing that was on its way. And I really don't like its execution. Now, that being said, the rest of the series is not very bad. The overall tone of this series is very 70s schlocky, and it's done intentionally. This is not like a lot of people were looking at the trailers and thinking, oh man, this is just kind of like YouTube level, like high tier cosplay. And it's not. I mean, it kind of is, but it's not that by accident. It's done very much on purpose. It's everything about the series, from music choices to aesthetic to everything, is anachronistic by choice. It's not an accident. It's not, everything has sort of like intent to it. You can tell sort of by the cinematography, the way they set up shots, the way they use lighting. These are all intentional choices. It's very much kind of like Sam Raimi-ish in that way, that it is aware of its kind of schlocky nature and it leans into it. It's not trying to be something that it's not. That sort of runs into conflict when you get these sort of cyberpunky settings and moments. And it's unfortunate that the budget for this could not afford for them to have the, just crazy set pieces that an anime has. But that's kind of just, I went in sort of expecting that. So I didn't think we were going to get the full, the full vibe of Venus or Ganymede or any of those other places that are very exotic locales to have in the original anime. A lot of the stuff in the remake here just feels like different parts of California, to be honest with you. As someone who lived there for a few years as a kid, I can still recognize it. So I guarantee you that people who live there or have lived there for a long time probably look at it and like, oh yeah, that's just the California coast or whatever. It doesn't read like another planet in most instances. They have a few key shots that do, but you don't really feel like you're anywhere other than Earth for the majority of this series, which is unfortunate because Earth is the one place that you barely go to with these characters' stories. So yeah, it's unfortunate that you just kind of feel grounded on Earth for most of the time. And every now and then they'll have this little bit that shows you we're not on Earth. And that's when you remember, oh yeah, okay, we're on, what was it? Ganymede. We were on Venus or whatever. And that's not a good way of handling that. You don't want to be, if it's all on Earth, that's fine. It would be fine. But then you have these moments where you're like, oh, you're not on Earth. It's like, well, why aren't you showing me that the whole time? Whatever. So the other thing about this is that this series is a season of a series. It's not a self-contained series the way that the original anime is. And that took me by surprise as well. I didn't think they were going to try and get multiple seasons out of this. Basically, this remake, it covers basically Spike's story. You touch a little bit on Jet's, you barely get into anything of Faye's, which, I mean, Faye has a pretty decent story in the anime. You get a little bit of it and then they move away from it because, there are a lot of characters involved here. And you only explore certain aspects of Spike's story. The original anime has a heavy element of kind of like that sort of monster of the week thing. It's kind of like X-Files. And whether or not you like the remake is going to depend on which version of X-Files you like. Do you like the monster of the week stories that X-Files would tell? Or do you like that sort of, overarching conspiracy? Now, back in the 90s, the conspiracy thing was what people were really interested in. But, as this series has kind of aged and people go back and watch it, most people tend to prefer those one-off or, 2-episode monster of the week situations of X-Files, and those tend to be the shining example. So what they do with the remake of Cowboy Bebop is they try and take those singular one-off episodes from the original and they try and tie them into the main story about the Syndicate and Spike and all this other stuff. And it works in some instances and it doesn't work in other instances. And my favorite villain from the original is LeFou. And I think he is incredibly creepy. That whole episode is great in showing just how outclassed Spike can be against someone as just absolutely insane and powerful as LeFou, and how something innocuous serves as his sort of weakness. But I would say like a good example of how they tie in everything to that is the character of LeFou, where in the remake, LeFou is someone that Vicious gets out of holding, puts back out onto the street and says, hey, the price of your freedom here is you got to go take this dude out. You got to go kill Spike. And LeFou's all for it. Instead of LeFou having this problem with cats, he has a problem with dogs because Ein. They need Ein to be more important in this series, and so they change the animal that sets LeFou off. But then also Ein is part of the same experimental stuff that LeFou was part of, where he's still a computer dog, but he can be overridden remotely. It's sort of weird. I don't necessarily like that, but it has a pretty small role, and that actually might be why I don't like it, because it doesn't mean enough in the overall story to introduce it and then just kind of like toss it away. I don't know. But LeFou is not nearly as intimidating. By leaning into the schlock, they lose some of the horror of that character. They're not able to walk that Sam Raimi line when it comes to that character. With most other characters, they do a pretty good job. A lot of the one-off stories from the original series are absent from this remake, and that's because they couldn't tie it in. But the story of the Syndicate resolves, essentially. Well, it resolves in a similar way, out the, cathedral window and everything like that. But Spike specifically survives, and they have this subplot within the remake in which Spike has not been upfront with Jet. And Jet is unaware of his Syndicate past, is mistaken about who he is, where he comes from, all this other stuff. And Jet's daughter that he has in this series is put into harm's way as Spike's past catches up with him, and Jet can't really reconcile those things. And basically by the end of the, this season, tells Spike to fuck off and leaves with the Bebop. So I'm not really a big fan of that, because it seems like it's intentionally thrown in there just to give you that sort of like, oh, we'll resolve this in season 2 kind of vibe. And I don't love that, but it, in and of itself, it did give Jet a lot more to do and a lot more to react to, instead of being this kind of like apathetic, shrug his shoulders kind of individual. So good and bad again. So we get to the end. Spike is still alive. Julia is essentially taken over the Syndicate. And then they introduce Ed. And Ed's scene, everyone's seen it on Twitter, I'm sure. That's the only scene that Ed is in. Ed is, for the entirety of this series, Ed is a background individual. The radical Edward personality is one that functions in the background through a computer screen, through messages, tips, things like that. And I thought that was a good way of handling a character like Edward, who is probably too cartoonish to translate over to a live action thing. And if they had stuck with that I would have been completely fine with that rendition of Edward, but they don't. But Edward's scene that everyone has seen floating around on the internet is just that scene, and it's essentially an after credits scene in the way that they handle it. Spike is down and out. He's hit rock bottom. He's completely just drinking his pain away. He just had this big battle with the Syndicate and all this other stuff, and He comes out of the bar, falls down in the alley, feeling pretty sad for himself. And I think the intention of that scene is supposed to be sort of through the eyes of someone who is absolutely wasted and depressed, and how just bizarre an individual like Ed is, in contrast to how Spike is feeling at the time. I think that's how it's supposed to go. I don't think it is well done. I don't think Edward is necessarily well done. I don't really like the way they handled Edward, but they have Edward come in and they basically are like, okay, we're setting up the next season. And Edward mentions, this person that she's trying to go after. And that is a hint as to what's to come, which ends up being the villain from the Cowboy Bebop movie, for anyone who's seen it, which could be interesting. But, I don't know if the show will get a season 2. I've seen worse shows that Netflix has done that get a season 2, but I've also seen better shows that Netflix has done not get an additional season. So this one feels really up in the air. Now, overall, like I said, I think the show was just okay. If you're someone who takes your anime very, very seriously, you're going to want to pass on this, but try not to get too worked up about it, because I don't think that it's worth getting worked up about. Now, if you're someone who enjoys anime, but you're not super deeply vested in it, and you want to see like a slight reinterpretation of events and how they could have gone down, the show probably has something to offer you. You can compare it sort of to the difference between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you think of it through the lens of like, this live action series is the events of the original, if just a couple things went a little different, then you might actually get more out of it than someone who is married to that original narrative. Because one of the big things that's different in this remake is essentially, it comes down to like two big things for me. One, Spike is not upfront with Jet. He does not give him an idea who he actually is or anything like that. So it creates this, it sets everything up for sort of this betrayal towards the end, which changes the way that these characters regard each other. The other thing is that the characters of the remake are much more willing to work with one another, much more willing to help each other out and work as a team by the time we get towards the end of these episodes. I'm going to say like episode 8 or 9 is where they're really operating as a team. And in the original, they're a group of misfits that work together with each other from time to time, but are really kind of individuals that are just in the same room. The remake is, so you can think of the remake as being like, what if Spike was not up front with Jet, and what if they worked more as a unit than a series of individuals? And that's the kind of story that you get. It's almost like, what if we changed a couple things? How would everything be different, vectoring off of that moment? So that's where it is. Now, I regret that it takes 30 minutes to get to that, but I wanted to be detailed without getting into every like little nitty gritty moment of the series, so that people have something that they can really walk away from and feel like they're informed on something, on whether they can make the decision of, oh, I'll check this out, or this probably isn't for me. I don't know if I'll do a lot more of these. I felt strongly about this series, even though I came away from it saying, it was all right. I really loved Cowboy Bebop growing up. I still really love Cowboy Bebop. I think it's a gold standard for anime as a whole, and I think it says a lot about anime that it's the gold standard, a couple decades after it came out. So I think that says a lot about anime, but that could be a totally different video. Regardless, I'm not much of a YouTuber. I don't do editing. I don't do a lot of stuff that's just me without someone else to chat with. So I don't know how many of these I'll do, but I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you got something out of it. And I hope to see you again on another one in the near future. Until then, have a good one.